The summer of 1971 arrived in Mercer County, Kansas, like a debt collector. Hot, dry, patient. The wheat fields along Route 56 had been struggling since April, and by the second week of June, the ground was cracking in lines that ran 3 and 4 feet deep. Ray Cutler stood at the edge of his east field on a Tuesday morning with a stick in his hand. He pushed the stick into the earth, went down 6 inches before hitting anything that felt like moisture. He pulled it out. Dry. Ray was 61 years old, had been farming the same 200 acres in Mercer County since 1938. Started at 21 with a borrowed tractor and a land contract he paid off over 11 years. The farm had survived the tail end of the Dust Bowl. It had survived 2 droughts in the 50s and a hard freeze in 1962 that killed half his winter wheat. It had survived the death of his oldest son in a tractor rollover in 1966. The farm was still there. Ray was still there. But the summer of 1971 was different. This wasn't a brief shortage. This was the 3rd dry year in a row, and the aquifer beneath Mercer County had been dropping steadily since 1968. His neighbors knew it, all of them. 8 farms within a 2-mile radius, and every one of them was dealing with the same cracked ground and the same question. Water. Where to get it? How to move it? How to pay for it? The answer the county extension office gave was the same answer every equipment dealer in the region was giving. Pivot irrigation, center pivot systems. A 1/4-mile arm rotating slowly over a field, spraying water drawn from a well. Efficient, reliable, modern. The dealers called it the future of dryland farming. They weren't wrong about what it could do. They were very specific about what it cost. Ray called 3 dealers that June. The numbers were close to identical. A center pivot system for a field his size ran between $28,000 and $34,000 installed. That was $1971. More than Ray had paid for the farm itself in 1938. More than he'd seen in any single year of farming. He had $4,200 in savings. He had a line of credit at First Farmers Bank in Colby that he'd used 3 times in 11 years and paid back all 3 times. His credit was solid. His collateral was the farm. His banker, a man named Gerald Foss, told him he could probably get approved for a $20,000 agricultural loan at 8.5% over 10 years. Ray thanked Gerald Foss. Drove home. Sat at the kitchen table for a long time. His wife Edith brought coffee. Left it on the table. Didn't say anything. She'd been watching this farm with him for 31 years. She knew what $20,000 at 8.5% over 10 years meant for a 200-acre wheat operation in a drought. Ray didn't sign the loan papers. By late June, 5 of his 8 neighbors had. The Halverson brothers put in 2 systems on their adjacent parcels. Dale Wicker signed for one in the last week of June. George Plum and his son-in-law bought a used system out of Colorado and had it trucked in. The equipment dealers were busy all summer. The installation crews worked 7 days a week. Ray Cutler watched all of it from his property line. Then he walked his land, slowly, for 3 days. He was looking at something. Specifically, he was looking at the way water moved across his land after the last rain, which had been in March. March had given them 1.5 inches over 4 days. Ray had watched that water. He'd watched where it went. He'd watched where it pooled, briefly, before disappearing into the cracked ground. He'd watched the drainage patterns, the way the east field sloped almost imperceptibly toward the southeast corner, toward the draw that marked the boundary between his property and Wicker's place. There was an old creek bed in that draw. Dry now, had been dry most of Ray's adult life. But it hadn't always been dry. His father-in-law, who'd farmed adjacent land until 1955, had told him about it. Before the wells started dropping, before the aquifer started giving out. Before the county dug the first irrigation wells in the late 1940s, there had been seasonal water in that draw every spring. Some years it ran for 3 months, some years only 4 weeks. But it ran. Ray started asking questions. At the county seat, at the State Geological Survey office in Topeka, where he drove on a Thursday in early July. At the library in Colby, where he sat for 2 afternoons reading agricultural bulletins from the 1920s and 1930s. What he found was not complicated. It was old. It was the kind of information that had been sitting in county records for 40 years without anyone caring about it. The draw on the southeast corner of his property sat at the bottom of a watershed that covered roughly 800 acres. His land, Wicker's land, the south half of the Halverson parcel. 3 additional parcels further north and east. When rain fell on any portion of that watershed, the water ran downhill through a series of shallow natural contours and eventually drained toward the southeast, toward the draw, toward the dry creek bed that nobody had paid attention to in 20 years. The Geological Survey map from 1931 showed the original creek. It showed the watershed boundary. It showed the drainage contours. The map was accurate. Ray had walked the ground himself that July. He could see the contours. The land told him the same story the 1931 map did. It hadn't changed. What had changed was the creek. Sometime in the late 1940s or early 1950s, the natural outlet of the creek had been partially blocked. Not deliberately. Sedimentation, mostly. A fence line built across the draw in 1949 by Wicker's father had caught debris during spring floods. The debris had built up over 20 years into a low berm, maybe 18 inches high and 12 feet wide, stretching across the lowest point of the draw. It wasn't dramatic. You'd walk right past it. But it had effectively choked off the natural drainage outlet and slowly starved the creek bed of its seasonal flow. Ray looked at that berm for a long time on a morning in mid-July. Then he went home and got a shovel. He didn't own a backhoe, didn't want to rent one, not yet. He dug by hand for 4 days, 3 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening, when the temperature dropped below 95 degrees. He dug a channel through the berm, starting narrow, maybe 8 inches wide, just to see what would happen, just to understand the water table beneath the debris. On the 3rd day of digging, the channel hit moisture at 14 inches down. On the 4th day, water began seeping into the channel at the uphill end. It was not a flood. It was a seep, half a cup per minute maybe. Dark, silty water that had been sitting in the saturated sediment beneath the berm for years. But it was water, and it was moving. Ray stopped digging. He watched. Over the next 3 days, without any further digging, the seep widened on its own. The saturated sediment upstream of the berm was releasing water slowly into the channel Ray had cut. By the end of the first week, the flow had increased to roughly 2 gallons per minute. By the end of the second week, it was closer to 8 gallons per minute, and the channel had widened naturally from his initial 8 inches to nearly 30 inches. Ray had not spent $1. He had spent approximately 28 hours of his own labor. He went back to Topeka. The State Geological Survey office had a hydrologist on staff, a woman named Dr. Carol Freese, who had been studying groundwater depletion in western Kansas since 1964. Ray showed her the 1931 watershed map. He showed her the measurements he had taken at the berm site. He showed her the flow readings he had recorded twice daily since the channel began running. Dr. Freese asked him several questions. She looked at his measurements carefully. She was quiet for a moment. She told Ray that what he had found was not a dry creek. It was a semi-perched aquifer. Groundwater from the 800-acre watershed upstream had been accumulating in the sediment layer beneath the draw, since the natural outlet was blocked in the 1940s. The water table there was 14 to 18 inches below surface. The berm had been acting like a dam. Not dramatic, not intentional, but effective. By breaching it, he had created a natural release point for water that had been building pressure for 20 years. She estimated the flow could sustain itself for 3 to 4 months of summer, given average precipitation on the watershed above. In a wet spring, longer. Ray asked how much water that meant over a season. Dr. Freese did the math. At 8 gallons per minute, running 18 hours a day, which was conservative, accounting for natural variation, the channel would move approximately 8,600 gallons daily. Over 90 days, roughly 774,000 gallons. Ray asked how much water a center pivot system used on 200 acres in a growing season. Dr. Freese looked at the irrigation studies on her shelf. She pulled a report from 1969. Kansas wheat, 200 acres. Efficient pivot system, good distribution uniformity. The number was approximately 800,000 to 900,000 gallons per season in a drought year. Ray was 61 years old. He had not taken an algebra course since 1929. But he understood numbers. He thanked Dr. Freese, asked if he could borrow the 1931 watershed map long enough to have a copy made. She made him a copy herself. He drove home. He called the county engineer's office in the morning and asked about right-of-way for a drainage ditch running from the draw across the southwest corner of his property, into his north field and then his east field. The county engineer, a man named Paul Earhart, told him that drainage ditches on private property were the landowner's business as long as they didn't divert water from a navigable waterway or damage adjacent properties. Ray's planned route did neither. It stayed entirely on his own land. It used water that was naturally flowing downhill toward his property's lowest point. It was legal, all of it. Ray hired one piece of equipment, a rental from the implement dealer in Colby, a Case 580 backhoe, rented for 3 days at $38 per day. He did the operating himself, $114 total. He dug a ditch, 7 feet wide at the surface, sloping to 18 inches at the bottom, 4 feet deep. The ditch ran 400 feet from the draw at the southeast corner of his property northward along the property line, then turned west into the center of his north field, where it fed into a series of shallow lateral cuts he dug with a hand-trenching tool over the following 2 weeks. The laterals were not deep, 8 inches. Wide enough to let water spread slowly into the soil at the root zone of the wheat. Not sprayed from above, not pumped from below. Just gravity-fed from the ditch, distributed by the natural slope of the field into the lateral cuts, seeping into the ground at a rate the soil could absorb. He seeded the ditch banks with native grass, stopped erosion, kept the channel clear. The total cost, $114 for the backhoe. Approximately $40 in fuel. 2 lengths of culvert pipe for the road crossing at the farm lane, $27. His own labor over 4 weeks, which he did not count. $181 in materials. Nothing else. By mid-August, the ditch was running. 8 to 10 gallons per minute, 7 days a week, fed by the semi-perched aquifer that Ray had released from behind the sedimentation berm. The laterals were distributing water across the north field. The east field was being fed through a secondary cut from the main ditch. Ray's wheat was still alive. His neighbor Dale Wicker drove by the farm on a Saturday in late August, slowed his truck, stopped, got out and looked at the ditch from the road for several minutes. He did not come to the door. 2 days later, he came to the door. He stood on the porch and said nothing for a moment. Then he asked Ray what he had done. Ray explained it. The berm, the semi-perched aquifer, the watershed map, the county right-of-way rules, the backhoe rental, the lateral cuts. Wicker was quiet. He asked how much it cost. Ray told him. Wicker went home. He came back the next week with the Halverson brothers. Ray walked all three of them out to the ditch, showed them the flow, showed them the laterals, showed them the 1931 watershed map, which he had pinned to a board in the barn. The Halverson brothers had spent $56,000 on 2 pivot systems. Wicker had spent $31,000 on one. They were making payments. They would be making payments for 9 more years. Ray's ditch cost him $181 and owed nothing to anyone. The wheat harvest in the fall of 1971 was not a record. It never would be. The drought had done damage before the ditch was running, and late-season irrigation only goes so far. But Ray brought in 22 bushels per acre on his north field and 19 on his east field, which was better than any of his neighbors except the Halversons, whose expensive pivot systems had been running since July. The ditch kept running. Not every year was the same. In 1973, a dry spring dropped the flow significantly. Ray supplemented with a small electric pump drawing from the ditch channel itself. $180 for the pump from a farm sale in Ness City. In a wet spring like 1975, the ditch ran from April through October, and Ray had more water than his fields could use. He extended one lateral cut to the west side of the north field, giving him coverage on the 220 acres total. He paid nothing for that water. He never would. The county extension agent, a man named Harv Tillotson, who had spent 10 years telling farmers to upgrade to pivot irrigation, heard about Ray's ditch sometime in the spring of 1972. He drove out to look at it in April of that year. He walked the ditch from the draw to the laterals. He looked at the watershed map. He looked at the flow measurements Ray had been keeping in a notebook since August 1971. Tillotson was quiet for a while. Then he said it was interesting. Said he hadn't seen this approach in Mercer County before. Asked if he could use Ray's watershed map and the geological survey information to prepare an extension bulletin. Ray said yes. The bulletin was published in the fall of 1972. It was titled, Passive Watershed Capture for Dryland Operations in Western Kansas. It circulated to 47 county extension offices across the state. Ray's name was not in it. He hadn't asked to be included. Tillotson had asked. Ray had declined. 3 farmers in adjacent Rawlins County used the bulletin to identify blocked drainage in their own draws that winter. 2 of them found semi-perched aquifers similar to Ray's. One of them found a larger accumulation. Enough for 300 acres of seasonal irrigation. His name was not published either. The method didn't go viral. There was no mechanism for that in 1972. It spread the way most agricultural knowledge spread in western Kansas in those years. Through fence-line conversations, at the grain elevator in Colby, at the implement dealer's counter on a slow Thursday afternoon. By 1976, 4 other farms in Mercer County had dug gravity-feed ditches using the passive watershed approach. None of them spent more than $300 on materials. None of them borrowed money. None of them were making payments on irrigation equipment. Ray Cutler farmed his land until 1984. His son took over that year, when Ray was 74, and his knees had given out after 46 years of farm work. The son ran the operation for 11 more years. The ditch ran the whole time. Same channel, same laterals, with minor maintenance every spring. A section of bank collapsed in 1979. They repaired it in a weekend with a borrowed tractor and 2 loads of fill. Cost them nothing but time. Ray died in 1989. He was 79. He had never borrowed money for irrigation. He had never paid a water bill. He had never replaced a pump motor or a pivot gearbox or a quarter-mile of aluminum pipe. His son sold the farm in 1995 to a young couple from Dodge City named the Bergmans, who wanted to run a mixed grain operation. The Bergmans walked the property before they signed the papers. They asked about the ditch. Ray's son explained it. The whole thing. The berm. The semi-perched aquifer, the 1931 map, the backhoe rental in 1971, the $181 materials, the ditch that had been running, with interruptions, for 24 years. The Bergmans kept the ditch, extended it actually. Added a small concrete headgate at the draw in 1997, cost them $640, including labor. Better control over the flow rate. Better distribution through the laterals. The ditch is still there. You can see it from the road if you know what to look for. A slight depression running north from the southeast corner of the property, lined with native grass, meeting a series of shallow cuts that spread west across the north field. Nobody named it. Nobody wrote it up in a farming magazine. It ran for 50 years because it followed the shape of the land. And the land hadn't changed. Ray Cutler spent $181 in the summer of 1971. His neighbors spent $31,000 to $56,000 that same summer. Their equipment wore out. Their loans were paid off by 1981, and their systems needed rebuilding by 1985. The ditch is still running.